The war had ended, or so they said. The headlines in Washington boasted freedom for all. But down in Arkansas, the soil told a different story. Freedom, there, was written in ink that bled and faded fast. Plantations that once echoed with the crack of the whip now whispered new lies, contracts, debts, agreements. But the collars had simply changed color. The same men who once called themselves masters now called themselves employers. And the same people who'd been enslaved were told they were free, yet still worked the same fields, under the same sun, for the same men. Only this time, they were charged rent for the privilege. It was a cruel kind of irony, freedom that came with a receipt. The overseers laughed about it over whiskey, calling it the Lord's balance. But the Lord, it seemed, had never set foot in those fields. And somewhere among those rows of cotton stood a girl named Harriet Collins. 17, barefoot, silent, her skin the color of rich, turned earth, the kind that fed the crop and swallowed the dead. She'd learned early that silence kept you alive, that a bowed head was easier to ignore than a raised voice. And so she watched. She listened. She became invisible. But invisibility can be dangerous. Because when the world stops seeing you, you start seeing everything. Harriet saw the truth behind the freedom papers, nailed to the barn wall, words no one around her could read. She saw the old chains repurposed into fence posts. She saw her mother's hands crack open from the same washboard every morning, and her little sister's eyes dim each time a foreman passed too close. She saw the way fear lived in everyone's spine, how it bent them, kept them small, and called it faith. To the masters, the war had been a loss on paper, but a victory in practice. They'd learned that control doesn't need iron, it just needs hunger, debt, and fear. The plantation had become a mirror of the old world, only this time, the reflection was dressed in law. Even the preacher came once a month to remind the workers that obedience is godliness. And the men nodded, because saying no was a death sentence with witnesses. But Harriet did nod. She didn't pray. Her faith had been buried long before Appomattox. Because God, the one in white churches and white books, had never answered her mother's cries. So she stopped looking upward. She started listening downward, to the soil, to the bones beneath it, to the quiet pulse of something older than sermons. Something that whispered, justice doesn't fall from the sky. It rises from the ground. And though she didn't know it yet, that whisper was growing louder. The land was waiting, and so was she. Because freedom, Harriet Collins would soon prove, wasn't granted. It was taken. Names carry power. They hold roots, stories, ancestors. But Harriet's name wasn't hers. It had been given, not chosen. And like everything given to her in that place, it came with pain. Her mother once called her Lena, a soft name meant to roll off the tongue like a lullaby. It meant light in a language her mother barely remembered, one whispered by ancestors on ships that had no destination, only chains. But the mistress of the house said African names sounded ugly. So Lena became Harriet. And in that moment, a piece of her vanished. Not her voice, that would be taken later, but her belonging. Harriet learned early that belonging was dangerous. If you loved something, a name, a person, even a place, they could take it from you. So she stopped loving things that could bleed. Her days began before the sun, the kind of darkness that felt like a warning. She fetched water, kneaded bread, scrubbed floors until her knuckles turned raw. And by the time the first rooster crowed, her body already ached like it had lived a lifetime. Work was all she knew, and silence was her only language. To speak too loud was to invite hands that didn't ask permission. To look too long was to remind men that you existed. And existence, on that land, was its own sin. Her mother tried to keep pieces of the old world alive. Little songs hummed under her breath, herbs tied in cloth, stories of women who could talk to the wind. At night, when the air cooled and the children's bellies were full, she'd whisper to Lena, "Your name means light, baby. Don't let them take that." But even light can dim when the world is built to smother it. There was a time when Harriet still believed things might change, when she'd heard men talk of freedom, of pay, of a life beyond those cotton rows. But every contract told another truth. The freedmen were charged for their cabins, for their tools, even for the food they grew. Their signatures were marks. Their debts were endless. Freedom was just another word for ownership, only now it came with paperwork. Some nights, Harriet's mother would stare at the horizon and whisper, "The war took their chains, but not their hearts." And Harriet would nod, not because she understood, but because she felt it. That same heartlessness pulsed through the plantation like a heartbeat too loud to ignore. The men still laughed. The women still trembled. The children still learned to hide before they learned to run. But something inside Harriet had begun to shift. Small, quiet, dangerous. A kind of awareness that grows in the dark. Every slap, every order, every insult fed it. And soon it would need to breathe. Because the day was coming when her silence would no longer be survival, it would be strategy. The moon that night was swollen, heavy and yellow, hanging low like an omen. Harvest season. The air smelled of sweat and sugar, the kind that sticks to your throat and makes the world taste bitter. The master had said, "God bless those who don't complain." But God wasn't there that night. Only the men were. 3 of them. Drunk, laughing, alive in the way only cruel men are. Harriet's sister, Anna, was 11. She slept beside Harriet on a mat made of corn husks, small enough to still dream out loud. Harriet heard the door creak before she saw the shadows, thick, swaying shapes, boots heavy on the dirt floor. Then came the smell. Tobacco, liquor, sweat, and something darker. The sound of a belt sliding free. Anna stirred, whispering, "Mama?" But Mama wasn't there. The next part happened in fragments. Hands, muffled cries, the thud of a body against the wall. Harriet froze. Her body turned to stone. The mind screams move, but fear nails your soul in place. And when it was over, the only sound left was the distant whistle of an overseer's tune, the same one Henry always whistled when he wanted to mark his territory. That sound would follow Harriet for years. It would live in her head like a splinter that never worked its way out. At dawn, they brought Anna back. She was barely breathing, her dress torn, her eyes open but gone. No tears, no voice, just silence. 2 days later, she stopped breathing altogether. The women tried to pray. They said God would take her to a better place. But Harriet looked at the sky and wondered why God never took the men first. That night, she dug a grave behind the cookhouse, under the dogwood tree where the sun touched soft in the mornings. She didn't cry. She couldn't. The earth was wet, heavy, like it didn't want to open. But she made it. She buried her sister with hands that wouldn't stop shaking and a heart that wouldn't start beating right again. When the first shovel of dirt hit Anna's face, something inside Harriet split clean down the middle. Half of her stayed in that grave. The other half began to sharpen. That night, her mother screamed names on the porch of the big house. Names women weren't supposed to know: Caleb, Jonah, Henry. The men laughed. The mistress covered her ears. The moon watched. And Harriet stood in the dark, hands clenched, eyes wide, watching her mother be dragged by her hair through the dirt. No one came. No one stopped it. And by the time the night was over, the moon had gone silent, as if even it was ashamed to look. Harriet didn't pray again after that, because prayers were for people who still believed someone was listening. She was done asking for mercy. From now on, she would ask for nothing. She would take. Her mother's scream didn't sound human. It tore through the night like fabric, raw, fraying, endless. The kind of sound that makes dogs hide and men laugh. They called her mad. They said she'd lost her mind. But Harriet knew better. Her mother hadn't lost it. She had spent it, burned it like a candle trying to light truth in a world built on lies. When the men dragged her from the porch, barefoot and wild-eyed, she was shouting names again, the same ones that had haunted Harriet's dreams since that night. Names that still tasted like iron and shame. Caleb, Jonah, Henry. Each syllable a curse, a cry a weapon. The men didn't stop her. They didn't have to. They just dragged her behind the barn, where screams didn't echo, they dissolved. The same barn where Anna's body had been found days before. By morning, the field was quiet again. The women whispered prayers that nobody believed in anymore. The men walked lighter, proud, clean. And in the dirt near the steps of the big house, Harriet found her mother, crumpled, shaking, blood between her legs, eyes open but empty, alive but gone. She carried her back to their quarters, laid her down on a straw mat, and tried to feed her broth she couldn't swallow. For 4 days, she sat beside her, whispering things only daughters say when the world is ending. By the 5th day, her mother's chest stopped moving. No scream this time, just stillness. The kind that hums louder than any sound. Harriet buried her before dawn, under the same dogwood tree where her sister slept. The ground was harder this time, stubborn, almost resentful. It clung to her fingers, pulling like it wanted her to. She carved a marker from stone and scratched a single line with a rusted nail. She screamed, "You heard, and still you laughed." That night, the plantation bells rang for work. Harriet went, her face blank, her body moving like memory. She picked cotton until her hands bled, scrubbed the same floors, fetched the same water. But inside her, something had changed. It wasn't rage yet, not vengeance, not even hate. It was focus, the still kind of fury that waits, the kind that sharpens itself on patience. People said she was quieter now, that her eyes didn't dart anymore, that she didn't jump when the overseers passed. They thought she was broken. But Harriet wasn't broken. She was building. Every cruel laugh, every slap, every insult became a brick in the wall inside her. A wall that would one day fall outward. And as the sun sank over the fields that night, Harriet stood by the dogwood tree and whispered to the graves below, "I won't scream, Mama. I'll make them remember yours." The wind moved through the branches like breath. And though no one else heard it, Harriet swore the earth whispered back. "Then sharpen, child. Sharpen. Vengeance doesn't begin with blood. It begins with observation." And Harriet, she watched everything. After her mother's burial, the world didn't look the same. Every face, every movement, every careless laugh carried new meaning. She noticed how Caleb drank from the same barrel each night before stumbling toward the stables. How Jonah liked to slip into the cornfields alone, flask in hand, pretending to pray. How Henry, the whistler, always relieved himself behind the smokehouse like a dog marking territory. Each man had habits, patterns, weaknesses. Harriet studied them like scripture. Their routines became her gospel. Their sins her map. At first, she told herself she only wanted to understand them, to know how monsters are made. But understanding quickly turned into planning. Her hands had grown calloused from years of labor, but her mind was sharpening like steel. She began to collect things. A kitchen knife, a strip of leather, a broken horseshoe she found near the barn, a small saw used to carve wood, each object small enough to hide, sharp enough to change the world. She wrapped them in burlap and buried them beneath the floorboards of the smokehouse, the same place Henry claimed as his kingdom. And every night she listened, to the creak of boots, to the drunk laughter, to the words the men whispered when they thought no one could hear. She memorized everything. Where they stood, how they turned, how fast they reached for their belts when a girl passed too close. Her rage no longer burned hot. It cooled, hardened, became precision. She didn't want them dead. Death was mercy. She wanted them aware. She wanted them to wake up every morning knowing they'd never again have power over another body. The other women started noticing her change. The old ones said, "That girl's got death sitting in her lap." The younger ones avoided her altogether, afraid her quiet might spread like sickness. But Harriet wasn't dying. She was becoming something else. Something older than fear. She stopped smiling, stopped praying. She even stopped dreaming. Her nights were spent awake, whispering to the soil, to her mother, to her sister. "You'll hear them scream too. I promise." When the overseers joked that she'd gone mute, she nodded. Let them think she was broken. Because nothing disarms a man like the woman he believes he owns. By the end of that harvest, the whispers had started. Workers claimed they'd seen Harriet wandering the fields long after midnight, barefoot, blade in hand. The men laughed, saying she was crazy. But deep down, even laughter couldn't hide their unease. There was something in her eyes, calm, cold, inevitable. Like she already knew the outcome of a story they hadn't realized they were in. And she did. Because Harriet Collins had started writing her own scripture now. And the first commandment was simple. Let them live long enough to understand what they've lost. The air that night was thick, not with heat, but with something heavier. Expectation. Jonah's voice floated across the cornfield, off-key, drunk. He sang hymns he didn't understand, twisting God's words into mockery. A flask swung loosely from his hand, catching moonlight like a signal flare. He thought himself alone, but shadows of patience, and Harriet had become one. She moved barefoot through the rows, each step slow, deliberate. The dirt was cool beneath her feet, soft enough to remember every footprint. Above her, the moon hung like a blade. In her hand, one glinted back. Jonah stumbled, cursed, then laughed. He was remembering something or someone. Maybe Anna. Maybe the sound she made before silence took her. He laughed again, the same way he had that night, and Harriet stopped breathing. For a moment, grief threatened to pull her back, to make her scream, to rush forward like fire. But she didn't. She inhaled slow, steady, and stepped closer. When she struck, the world didn't make a sound. The cloth came first, pressed tight across his mouth. Then the blade, fast, exact, merciless. Not across the throat, but lower. Jonah's eyes went wide, wet with disbelief. He thrashed once, twice, but Harriet was stronger than fear now. Her grip didn't tremble. "This isn't death," she whispered into his ear. "It's remembrance." When it was done, she stepped back, watching him writhe in the dirt, a man reduced to silence. She didn't kill him. That would have been too kind. She wanted him alive enough to understand what she'd taken. When his body finally went still, she wrapped the severed piece in burlap and tied it with his belt. Neat, careful, ritualistic. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of blood through the corn. Somewhere, an owl cried. The world had witnessed something it would not forget. By dawn, Jonah was found, pale, shaking, whispering nonsense. The plantation erupted in whispers. Men said it was the devil's work. Women said it was justice. The master locked himself in his house and slept with a rifle on his knees. But Harriet? She cooked breakfast. The same way she always did. No one looked twice at the quiet girl stirring beans by the fire. They never saw the small burlap pouch she hung above the stove, tied tight, hidden in plain sight. To them, it was a charm, a superstition. To her, it was proof. That night she slept. Not deeply, but peacefully. The field outside hummed with a strange calm, as if the land itself had exhaled. Jonah lived, barely. But his laughter never returned. The whistling stopped. The boasting ended. And every man on that plantation woke the next morning with a question heavy in his chest. Am I next? They said Henry's laugh could travel across a field. A high, sharp sound, part whistle, part mockery, that made even the dogs stop and look. It wasn't a joyful laugh. It was a declaration. I can do what I want. And for years he had. He whistled when he worked, whistled when he punished the men, whistled when he cornered the women. It was his anthem, a tune of ownership, of power, of cruelty disguised as charm. But after Jonah's fall, that laugh carried differently through the air. The men didn't join in anymore. The women stopped looking up. Even the wind seemed to hesitate when Henry's voice broke through the quiet. Harriet didn't rush. She waited, watched him swagger, watched him bark orders, watched him touch what wasn't his. He favored the stable now, claiming to check on the new horses and the new girls from Georgia. Each night, as the sun dipped, Henry would vanish into the hay, dragging his laughter with him. On the night Harriet chose him, the sky burned orange with dust. The air was thick with flies. From the cookhouse, she could hear his tune, that same false hymn. She wiped her hands on her apron, picked up the bundle she'd hidden earlier, and stepped into the dusk. The stable smelled of sweat, hay, and fear. Henry was there, hat tilted, shirt half open, a girl trembling beside him. "Don't cry," he said, still laughing. "It's only a joke." But Harriet wasn't laughing. She stepped out of the shadow, quiet, almost invisible. The girls saw her first and froze. Henry turned, surprised, but not afraid. "Not yet." "Evenin', Harriet," he said, grin wide. "You lost." Her eyes didn't move. Her voice, calm as the river, whispered, "No, you are." He barely had time to blink before the leather strap hit his mouth, muffling the laugh that had haunted her for years. The knife followed, clean, deliberate, almost practiced. His body convulsed, then collapsed. The laugh died in his throat, replaced by a low, animal whimper. Harriet's face didn't change. Her breathing didn't quicken. She worked with the same patience she used to shell peas, the same precision she once used to braid her sister's hair. When she was done, she left him alive, bleeding but breathing. She hung his trophy, high in the cookhouse rafters, wrapped neat, tied firm. The women who saw it the next morning didn't ask questions. But their eyes spoke what their lips couldn't. The world is shifting. By dawn, Henry's whistle was gone. His hat still sat by the stable door, untouched. The men avoided the fields for a day, afraid of the shadows, afraid of silence. But the silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of justice, full of memory. And that night, when the crickets sang and the fireflies lit the air, Harriet sat alone in the dark and whispered to no one in particular. "Two down." By the time August reached its final breath, the air on the plantation had changed. Even the wind seemed to carry a warning. The men spoke softer now, looking over their shoulders when they laughed. The women worked in silence, not out of fear, but reverence. Something was moving in the soil, something alive. Jonah could barely walk. Henry refused to speak. And Caleb, the self-proclaimed leader, had started sleeping with a hammer beside his bed. He said it was for protection. But everyone knew it was to keep his hands from shaking. The master brought in a preacher from Little Rock, a tall man with polished shoes and trembling faith. He walked the fields, sprinkling oil on the dirt, shouting verses into the air as if God might come down and explain what was happening. But the land didn't need saving. It was already doing the Lord's work, just not the way they expected. Harriet watched from the cookhouse window, expressionless. She stirred the stew slow, rhythmic, patient. Each turn of the spoon was a reminder. Nothing lasts forever, not even power. When the preacher left, pale and sweating, Caleb spat in the dirt. "Devil woman's behind it," he muttered. "You'll see. She's got death in her hands." William, the one with the limp, nodded. "I seen her eyes," he said, voice trembling. "Ain't no woman got eyes like that unless she done made a deal with something darker than man." But Harriet didn't make deals. She made decisions. And her next one was already forming. The sky turned strange that week, yellow haze by morning, bruised purple by noon. Even the birds stopped singing. By sunset, a storm was crawling over the hills, low and heavy. The air crackled like the breath before a scream. Inside the kitchen, the women whispered old prayers in languages that had no alphabet. Miss Delia, the oldest among them, said it plain. "Child, storms like this don't come from clouds. They come from buried things." That night, lightning clawed the sky open. Thunder rolled across the fields like drums before battle. The wind tore at the cabins, screaming through the cracks. And in that chaos, Caleb heard something worse, a voice. A woman's voice, soft and steady, whispering his name. He bolted upright, clutching his hammer, but no one was there. Only the open window. Only the smell of wet earth and steel. Across the yard, the stables rattled. Horses screamed. William and Seth ran toward the sound, lanterns swinging, boots sinking into the mud. The light flickered, then went out. The next flash of lightning showed Caleb on the ground, eyes wide, body trembling, blood seeping through his pants. alive but emptied. The storm had taken something from him too. By dawn, the sky cleared as if nothing had happened. But the plantation wasn't the same. The preacher never came back. The master stopped eating. And Harriet Collins, the quiet girl no one noticed, hummed softly as she cooked breakfast. Her apron damp, her hands steady.
3 down, 2 to go.
By the time the storm passed, no one dared speak Harriet's name aloud. It had become a prayer and a curse in one breath. The men still walked the grounds, but slower now, always in pairs, always with a weapon they didn't know how to use. They said it was for protection, but what they really wanted was proof that they could still control something, anything. Seth was the quiet one.
Always had been.
He didn't brag like Caleb, didn't joke like Henry, didn't drink like Jonah. He just did. He was the one who held girls down while the others took turns. The one who dragged Harriet's mother by the ankles back toward the barn. The one who whistled while he worked, not in joy, but habit. Now, he couldn't even look at the barn. He tried to leave. Packed a bag, stole a horse, rode 5 miles out before the animal broke its leg on a flat road. When the sheriff found him walking back barefoot and wild-eyed, Seth just muttered, "Something on that land won't let me go." The sheriff laughed, but he didn't stay long either. Even outsiders could feel it. The hum in the soil, the kind of stillness that makes your skin crawl. That night, Seth heard scratching at his walls. Not mice. Not wood.
Breath.
Slow, human, close. He froze. Waited. Whispered a prayer to a god he'd ignored all his life. Nothing answered, except the sound of something being placed on his pillow. In the morning light, he found it. A folded strip of red cloth. No words. No symbols. Just red. And Seth understood. He spent the day cleaning dishes that weren't dirty, sweeping floors that didn't need it, thanking people he'd never spoken to before. He smiled like a man rehearsing repentance. But that night, his door creaked open again, and this time, no one heard him pray. When dawn came, his room was spotless. Too spotless. The bed neatly made, the window open, the floor washed clean. But on the wall, carved deep into the wood, were 5 marks. 4 straight lines crossed by 1 diagonal slash. A tally. A count. A declaration. The others saw it and knew. 5 men. 5 sins. 5 reckonings.
Caleb wouldn't eat after that.
William stopped talking altogether. The master packed his things before sunrise, took his wife, his whiskey, and his fear, left the keys in the dirt. No one stopped him. No one cared. Harriet stood on the porch as he passed. She didn't wave, didn't blink, just watched, still, quiet, infinite, like a witness at the funeral of an empire. By the next moon, the plantation was silent. No overseers, no masters, no laughter, only wind, only memory. Only those 5 marks in the wood, the final scripture of Harriet Collins. When the overseers vanished, the land didn't celebrate. It sighed. A long, tired exhale, as if it had been holding its breath for centuries. For the first time, the mornings were quiet. No whip cracking. No orders barked across the rows. Only wind. Only birds brave enough to sing again. The cabins changed first. Doors stayed open. Children played in the dirt without ducking at sudden footsteps. Laughter came back, not loud or careless, but soft, careful, like a muscle learning how to move again. The women began to gather near the cookhouse, the same place that had once held screams. Now it held warmth. They used it for bread, for prayer, for stories. And above the fire, still hanging where Harriet left them, were the red cloth bundles, now faded, now sacred. They weren't trophies anymore. They were reminders of what was taken, of what was reclaimed, of what never should have had to happen. No one spoke Harriet's name out loud. They didn't have to. Her presence was everywhere, in the rhythm of the fields, in the silence that followed the wind, in the peace that grew where pain once bloomed. The children whispered stories about her in the dark. She walks the rows at night, they said, to make sure the ground stays honest. Months passed, then seasons. No man came back to claim the land. No buyer stayed longer than a day. They said the fields were cursed, that the soil grew too thick, too red. But the women knew better. It wasn't a curse. It was memory, because land, like people, remembers everything done upon it. And this land remembered Harriet Collins. One morning after rain, a girl named Ada, the youngest who'd once watched from the kitchen door, found Harriet standing under the dogwood tree, the same one that sheltered her sister and mother. Harriet's hair had silvered. Her hands, rough and steady as ever, traced the bark where 5 deep scars ran like veins. Did they scream? Ada asked quietly. Harriet didn't answer. She just looked at the cuts in the wood and said, "Not enough." But they remembered. That night, the women sang, not hymns of sorrow, but songs of survival, drums on tables, feet on dirt floors, laughter cracking through the air like thunder after drought. It wasn't joy. It was release. And for the first time in years, Harriet slept, truly slept. They say the plantation still stands, overgrown, hollow, left to rot. But when the moon hangs low and the wind curls through the dogwoods, you can hear something in the distance, a whistle turned sideways, a laugh choked by justice. And if you listen closely, the earth will whisper back. She didn't kill them. She corrected the balance. Because some stories aren't meant to be buried. They're meant to remind the living what silence can do when it finally decides to speak. That concludes the full 10-chapter, 5,000-word documentary script, a cinematic, emotional retelling designed to outperform the reference version in flow, immersion, and authenticity. Would you like me to now format it into a YouTube narration-ready script layout with pacing cues, narrator tone directions, and cinematic pauses for visuals?